I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. I always thought my life was normal, nothing extraordinary but certainly nothing to complain about. Sarah and I had been together for 9 years. We built a life, a family, and a routine that gave me a sense of stability, the kind I figured was enough to keep any marriage afloat. But it was all a lie, and I should have seen it coming long before that trip to North Carolina. We were packing up for what was supposed to be a relaxing vacation in the mountains. It had been a while since we'd taken a trip, and I thought it would be a chance for us to reconnect. Lately, Sarah had seemed distant. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I figured she was stressed from work or just needed some time away from the grind. I brushed off the nagging feeling in my gut, thinking I was just being paranoid. The drive to North Carolina was smooth. The kids were dozing off in the back seat, and Sarah sat next to me, scrolling through her phone like she always did. There was nothing out of the ordinary, until we stopped at that gas station. It was a typical roadside Wawa, the kind you pull into when you're hours into a road trip and desperately need a bathroom break. Sarah had been sipping on water for most of the drive, so it was no surprise when she asked me to pull over. "I'll just be a minute," she said, leaving her phone on the passenger seat as she stepped out. I didn't think twice about it at first. I was preoccupied with checking the map on my phone, figuring out how long we had left until we reached the cabin. Then, her phone buzzed. A simple vibration, nothing loud. I glanced over and noticed a message light up her screen. I wasn't the kind of guy who snooped through my wife's phone, but something about this particular moment made me curious. The message was from someone named Nick. "Can't wait to see you tonight." I stared at the words, my mind racing. Who the hell was Nick? Why was he talking about seeing her tonight? We were supposed to be spending the entire week together in the mountains. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I didn't know what to do. Should I confront her right there? Should I let it go and see if there was some reasonable explanation? Before I could even decide, I saw Sarah coming out of the Wawa, and she was sprinting, full speed, toward the car. She wasn't just walking quickly, she was flat out running, her eyes fixed on the phone in my hand. I hadn't even realized I was holding it until she yanked it from my grasp. "What are you doing with my phone?" she asked, her voice sharp, almost panicked. I looked at her, still in shock, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But instead of answering, I let it go. I wasn't ready to fight, not here, not now. I simply shook my head and mumbled something about it buzzing and me just glancing at it. She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't push it either. The rest of the drive was quiet. Too quiet. Sarah kept checking her phone, pretending to scroll through social media, but I knew she wasn't being her usual self. My mind was running wild with possibilities, but I stayed calm on the outside. The kids were still asleep, and the last thing I wanted was to ruin our family trip with accusations I wasn't even sure about yet. When we finally got to the cabin, Sarah seemed to relax. She smiled more, laughed with the kids, and everything felt normal again. But the moment we were alone, the tension crept back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That message from Nick kept replaying in my head, and every time Sarah's phone buzzed, I wondered if it was him. We spent 4 days in the mountains. We hiked, roasted marshmallows by the fire, and tried to make the most of our time together. But there was something different about Sarah. She was more distant than ever. Even when we were intimate, her mind seemed to be somewhere else. Every time I reached for her, she seemed distracted, her eyes darting to her phone, which she kept close by, as if it held the key to her secret life. I didn't say anything, not during the trip at least. I kept quiet, hoping I was wrong, hoping that when we got back home, things would go back to the way they used to be. But deep down, I knew better. On the second night back from the trip, I couldn't take it anymore. After Sarah had fallen asleep, I snuck downstairs, grabbed my laptop, and opened up our phone bill online. I started combing through the list of calls and texts. It didn't take long to find the number, Nick's number. There were dozens of texts between them, all at strange hours, during times she should have been at work, or worse, with me. My heart pounded as I clicked through each text, piecing together their conversations. It was all there. The late-night messages, the secret meetups, the excuses about work trips that I now knew were just lies. I wanted to scream, to break something, but I kept it together. I needed more. I needed to confront her with undeniable proof. The next day, I did some digging. I ran Nick's number through a reverse lookup service, and sure enough, it came back as a burner phone, a VoIP number. He was trying to stay hidden, and that only confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't just some casual fling. It was deliberate. They were both in on it, and they had been for months. I started planning my next move. I knew I couldn't confront her right away. I needed time to figure out how I was going to handle this, how I was going to get my revenge without losing everything in the process. Sarah had no idea I was onto her. She kept up the facade, pretending everything was fine, but I wasn't the fool I had been before. I started gathering evidence, saving texts, taking screenshots, and compiling everything I could find. I even set up a meeting with a divorce lawyer, laying out the situation and figuring out my options. It was hard to keep up the charade, pretending I didn't know, but every time I looked at her, the betrayal cut a little deeper. I thought about the kids. How was I going to protect them from this? How was I going to make sure they didn't get caught in the middle of our mess? They didn't deserve any of this. Sarah had destroyed the life we had built together, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. But I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. No, I had a plan, and when the time was right, she would feel the full weight of her actions. For now, I waited. I watched. And I prepared for the moment I would make my move. The weeks after that vacation felt like walking through quicksand. Every day, I sank deeper into a pit of suspicion and anger, and the more I uncovered, the more I realized how elaborate Sarah's betrayal had been. I played my part perfectly, though. She had no idea I knew about Nick or the lies she had been weaving for months. It wasn't easy, but I kept up the facade, pretending everything was fine, waiting for the right moment to strike. I'd become an investigator in my own home, quietly gathering evidence without raising suspicion. My nights were spent scrolling through old phone records, scanning Sarah's emails, and even setting up alerts for any large transactions on our bank accounts. I was a man on a mission, and every new piece of information I found fueled the fire inside me. One night, while Sarah was asleep, I found what I was looking for, the final piece to confirm everything. Hidden deep in her email archive, I discovered travel confirmations for hotel stays during her supposed work trips. The thing was, these weren't business hotels. These were luxury resorts, far from any conference centers, in cities she had never mentioned visiting. Orlando, Miami, even Las Vegas. And every single trip coincided with work meetings that she had told me about. It all clicked into place. Sarah hadn't been working late or going out with friends. She had been with Nick, traveling across the country to spend weekends in expensive hotels with him while telling me she was stuck in some boring conference. My blood boiled as I stared at the screen, the details of her deceit glaring back at me. I wanted to storm upstairs and confront her right then, to scream and demand answers. But I didn't. I had to stay calm, play the long game. A few days later, Sarah mentioned another work trip. She said it so casually over breakfast, sipping her coffee like nothing was wrong. I'll be heading to Dallas next weekend. There's a big pharmaceutical conference, and my boss wants me to network with some new clients, she said, barely looking up from her phone. I nodded, pretending to be disinterested. Sounds good. Need me to pick up the kids from school that Friday? She smiled, relieved by my lack of curiosity. Yeah, that would be great. I'll be back Sunday night. I knew exactly where she was going, and it sure as hell wasn't Dallas. I didn't need to check her flight or hotel reservations to know she'd be meeting Nick somewhere. But that was fine. This trip was going to be her last lie. In the days leading up to her departure, I finalized my plans. I contacted my lawyer again, making sure everything was ready for when I filed. I had already started moving money out of our joint account into a private one she couldn't touch. I made sure the kids would be with my parents for the weekend. No way was I going to let them witness what was coming. Then, on the morning Sarah was supposed to leave for her work trip, I kissed her goodbye, told her to be safe, and waved as she drove off. I waited until her car was out of sight before I sprang into action. I went straight to the computer and logged into her email, downloading everything: emails, receipts, photos. I wanted all the evidence laid out, ready for when the time came to confront her. But there was something else I needed. I knew that catching her in the act would be the final blow, the thing that sealed her fate. So, I hired a private investigator. I gave him everything he needed: Nick's number, Sarah's flight details, and her hotel reservation. I told him where she would be and when, and I made sure he understood one thing: I wanted photos, video, whatever it took. I wanted undeniable proof of her affair, something she couldn't talk her way out of. The weekend crawled by, every minute a test of my patience. I kept telling myself that soon, this would all be over. I'd have the proof I needed, and Sarah's web of lies would come crashing down. Still, it was hard to sit there, knowing she was with him, pretending to be on some work trip while I was home alone, waiting. By Saturday night, I got the first update from the PI. It was exactly as I expected. He sent me a text with a photo, a grainy shot of Sarah and Nick, walking hand in hand into a hotel, looking every bit the happy couple. There was no conference, no networking. Just her, with him, in another city, doing exactly what I knew she'd been doing for months. It was surreal, seeing her like that. The woman I had loved, the mother of my children, laughing and smiling with another man as if I didn't exist. But instead of breaking down, instead of falling apart, I felt calm. My plan was working. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, it would be time to make my move. When Sarah came back home on Sunday, she was her usual self, kissing me on the cheek, asking about the kids, telling me how productive her trip had been. I smiled and played along, not giving away anything. But inside, I was already preparing for the storm that was about to hit. Over dinner that night, I decided to test the waters. "So, how was the conference?" I asked casually, taking a bite of my food. She looked up, a bit surprised by the question. "Oh, you know, the usual. Long presentations, boring meetings. Nothing exciting." I nodded, pretending to be sympathetic. "That's a shame. I thought maybe you'd at least have some fun while you were there." She smiled, clearly relieved that I wasn't prying. "Not really, but it's over now. I'm just glad to be back home." It took everything in me not to explode, not to throw the evidence in her face and watch her squirm. But I needed to stay patient, to wait until I had everything lined up. So, I let her enjoy her evening, completely unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. That night, after she had gone to bed, I pulled out my phone and reviewed the final report from the PI. It was all there: photos of Sarah and Nick together, timestamps that matched the hotel check-ins, and even a recording of them at dinner, talking about their next trip. It was everything I needed, neatly wrapped in a folder, ready for the lawyer. The next day, I called my lawyer and gave him the green light. "I've got everything. Let's move forward." He didn't ask many questions, just told me he'd file the papers and start the process. It would be a few weeks before Sarah was served, but that was fine. I had waited this long. I could wait a little longer. Over the next few days, I went about my business as usual, keeping everything under wraps. Sarah had no idea what was coming, and that was exactly how I wanted it. She continued her routine, still texting Nick, still planning more work trips, completely oblivious to the fact that I was about to blow her life apart. The day the divorce papers were served was almost anticlimactic. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking her coffee when there was a knock at the door. I had arranged for the server to come while I was still home. I wanted to be there when she realized what was happening. She opened the door, and I watched as the color drained from her face. She glanced at the envelope in her hands, her eyes wide with confusion, then looked at me. What is this?" I stood up, my expression calm, and said, "It's over, Sarah. I know everything." Her face twisted in panic, her hands trembling as she opened the envelope. "Mike, what are you talking about? What do you mean?" I didn't bother explaining. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching her as the truth began to sink in. She looked through the papers, her breathing quickening, her eyes darting back and forth between me and the documents in her hands. "You think I don't know about Nick? You think I haven't been watching you for months?" I said, my voice steady, but cold. "I've got all the proof I need. Photos, texts, everything. It's done." Sarah stumbled back, dropping the papers on the floor. "No. Mike, please, I can explain." But there was no explaining. Not anymore. Sarah's reaction was exactly what I had expected: shock, denial, and then, inevitably, desperation. As she stood there, pale and trembling, staring at the divorce papers on the floor, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment she realized she had been caught. "Mike, please listen to me. It's not what you think," she stammered, her voice thick with panic. I raised an eyebrow, folding my arms across my chest. "It's not what I think," I repeated, incredulous. "So, you weren't sneaking around with Nick while pretending to be on work trips? You weren't lying to me and the kids for months, maybe longer?" She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The truth was too obvious. There was no way she could talk her way out of this, and we both knew it. The power I had in that moment was intoxicating. After months of feeling like a fool, I finally held all the cards. "Mike. I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was a mistake, A mistake." I cut her off, my voice sharp. "A mistake is one thing, Sarah. But this? This was a full-blown affair. You didn't slip up once. You lied to me over and over again. You lied to our kids. You lied to yourself." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might break down completely. Part of me expected to feel something, maybe pity, maybe anger, but all I felt was cold detachment. This was what she had brought upon herself. "I thought we were happy," I continued, my tone calmer now, almost resigned. "I thought we had a good life. I trusted you, Sarah. I trusted you with everything." She took a step toward me, her eyes pleading. "We were happy, Mike. I was happy. But I don't know, things changed. I felt like we were drifting apart, like you didn't care about me anymore." "Didn't care about you?" I asked, barely able to contain my frustration. "I've been here, every single day, working, raising our kids, trying to build a life for us. I've been doing everything I can for this family, and you're telling me I didn't care?" She shook her head quickly, wiping her eyes. "I didn't mean it like that. I was lonely, Mike. I felt like we weren't connecting anymore. And then Nick came along, and you decided to throw away everything we built together for him." I interrupted. "You decided to cheat, to lie, and to betray me and our kids, because you were lonely." I could see her struggling to find the right words, but every excuse she gave just made her look weaker, more pathetic. I was done listening to her justifications. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice firm. It's over, Sarah. I'm taking full custody of the kids, and you're going to have to figure out your life without me. The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her face crumpling as the reality of the situation sank in. Mike, please, don't do this. Don't take the kids away from me. I love them. I love you. I can fix this. We can fix this. But I shook my head. There's nothing left to fix. I can't trust you, Sarah. You've destroyed any chance of that. And I'm not going to let you drag the kids through this mess. She collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. It was a pitiful sight, and for a brief second, I almost felt bad for her. But then I remembered everything, the late-night texts, the lies, the vacations where she left me home with the kids while she was off with Nick, and the sympathy vanished. I left her there, sobbing, and went upstairs to pack a few things. I wasn't going to stay in the house with her anymore. I had already arranged to stay at a friend's place for a while until I could get things sorted. The kids were still at my parents' house, and they didn't know what was going on yet. I'd have to figure out how to explain it to them soon, but that was a problem for another day. As I packed my bags, I heard Sarah's footsteps coming up the stairs behind me. She stood in the doorway, still wiping away tears, but her voice was quieter now, more composed. Mike. I know I've hurt you. I know I've messed up. But please, don't leave like this. Don't walk away without giving me a chance to make things right. I zipped up my suitcase, not even bothering to look at her. There's nothing to make right, Sarah. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. She walked closer, reaching out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. You can't just give up on us, she said, her voice shaking. I still love you, Mike. I love our family. Please don't take that away from me. I finally looked at her then, really looked at her. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale and desperate. This was the woman I had built a life with, the mother of my children. And yet, standing there in front of me, she felt like a stranger. I didn't give up on us, Sarah. You did, I said, my voice low but steady. You gave up the moment you started sneaking around behind my back. You gave up when you lied to me over and over again. I've spent months trying to figure out how to make this work, how to hold our family together. But you've been with him, acting like none of this matters. Her lip trembled, and she opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off before she could speak. I'm not staying here tonight. I'll be back tomorrow to pick up the kids. After that, we'll figure out the logistics. But as far as we're concerned, Sarah, this marriage is over. I grabbed my suitcase and brushed past her, heading down the stairs without looking back. I heard her call my name as I reached the front door, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If I stayed a moment longer, I knew I might lose my resolve, and I couldn't afford that. Not now. The air outside was cool, and as I stepped out of the house, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel trapped in my own life. I didn't feel like I was being suffocated by lies and deceit. I was free. I got into my car and drove away, leaving Sarah standing at the door. I didn't know where this road would take me, but I knew one thing for sure, there was no going back. The next morning, I returned to the house to pick up the kids. I had arranged with my parents to take them for a few days while Sarah and I worked through the logistics of the separation. They didn't know the full story yet, only that Sarah and I were going through a rough patch. When I arrived, Sarah was already waiting by the door, looking exhausted and fragile. She had clearly spent the night crying. I didn't say much to her as I packed the kids' things, and she didn't try to talk to me either. It was an unspoken agreement between us that, for now, we would keep things civil in front of the kids. As I loaded their bags into the car, Sarah stood nearby, her eyes fixed on me. I could feel her desperation, her regret, but it didn't move me. I had made up my mind. This was the end of our marriage. "Mike, before you go," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we at least talk about what happens next? I don't want to lose the kids. Please don't take them away from me." I paused, my hands resting on the car door. "We'll figure it out," I said without looking at her. "But you need to understand that things are going to be different from now on." She nodded, wiping her eyes again. I don't want them to hate me." "They don't hate you, Sarah. They don't even know the full story yet. But when they do, you're going to have to live with the consequences of your actions. That's the reality." With that, I got into the car and drove away, leaving her behind. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw her standing there, watching us disappear down the street. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or betrayal. I just felt empty. Weeks passed after I left the house. The divorce process was slow and brutal, but necessary. Sarah had made a few attempts to reach out, to talk, to work things out, but I wasn't having it. She kept sending me texts, some long and apologetic, others angry and defensive. I ignored most of them. My focus was on the kids and the future. I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the mess she'd created. The kids were adjusting as well as could be expected. They didn't know the full details yet, only that mom and dad were living apart for a while. I'd shielded them from the worst of it, but soon enough, the truth would have to come out. They were smart, they knew something more was going on. I dreaded the day they'd learn the full story. As for Sarah, I tried to keep the communication between us minimal, strictly about the kids and logistics. But every now and then, she'd slip in some plea for forgiveness, some attempt to reignite what had long since burned out. It was exhausting. And then, out of nowhere, she stopped reaching out altogether. A week went by with no texts, no emails, nothing. Part of me was relieved, thinking maybe she'd finally accepted that it was over. But another part of me wondered what was going on. It wasn't like her to go completely silent. And then, one afternoon, I got the call that changed everything. It was from her lawyer. The tone was formal, but there was an edge to it, something that made my stomach twist. "Mr. Martin, I'm calling with some urgent news regarding Sarah." I braced myself. "What is it?" There was a pause, a hesitation. "She's in the hospital, Mike. There's been an accident." My heart dropped. "What? What kind of accident?" She had a car crash last night. It was pretty bad. She's in intensive care. The doctors aren't sure if she's going to make it." I stood there, frozen, the words washing over me like icy water. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected any of this. "Which hospital?" I finally managed to ask. After getting the details, I hung up and stood there, staring at the wall. My emotions were all over the place. I felt anger, sadness, confusion. Was I supposed to feel sympathy for her? Was I supposed to care? She had betrayed me, lied to me, torn our family apart. And yet, hearing that she was lying in a hospital bed, possibly dying, stirred something deep inside me. Without really thinking, I grabbed my keys and drove to the hospital. The entire drive was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything except the pounding in my chest, the twisting feeling in my gut. Part of me wanted to turn the car around and go back home. But another part of me knew I had to see her, had to understand what was happening. When I arrived at the hospital, they led me to the ICU. The nurse at the desk gave me a sympathetic look as she directed me to Sarah's room. I wasn't ready for what I saw. There she was, lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to machines, her face bruised and swollen, her body almost unrecognizable beneath the wires and tubes. She looked fragile, so unlike the woman I had been married to for the past decade. My anger melted away in that moment, replaced by something else, pity, sorrow, maybe even regret. I sat down next to her bed, unsure of what to do. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence. Her eyes were closed, and the rise and fall of her chest was shallow, almost imperceptible. I hadn't expected to feel this way, hadn't expected to feel anything at all. But sitting there, watching her like that, I realized that despite everything, a part of me still cared. "Sarah," I whispered, not even sure if she could hear me. "What happened?" I stayed there for hours, waiting for some kind of sign, some indication that she'd wake up. But nothing came. As the evening wore on, I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Not like this. Just as I was about to leave, a doctor came in, her expression serious but professional. "Are you her husband?" she asked. "Ex-husband, technically," I said. "But, yeah, I'm here." She nodded, glancing at Sarah's chart. "She's stable for now, but it's still touch and go. We're doing everything we can, but the next 24 hours are critical." I swallowed hard, nodding. Do you know what happened?" The doctor looked at me, her eyes softening. "It was a car accident, but," she hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "It seems like it wasn't just an accident. There were no skid marks on the road. No sign of her trying to stop." My stomach dropped. "You mean, you think she did this on purpose?" She didn't answer directly, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. My mind was racing, trying to process everything. Had Sarah tried to end her life? Was it because of the divorce? Because of Nick? Had I pushed her to this point? I spent the next day in a fog, barely able to focus on anything. I called the hospital a few times for updates, but her condition hadn't changed. The kids were still with my parents, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. It wasn't until the following evening that the surprise hit me. I was sitting at home, staring at the TV without really watching, when my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Hello." There was a pause, then a low voice on the other end. "Mike, it's Nick." I sat up straight, my heart pounding. "What the hell do you want?" Listen, this is going to sound crazy, but you need to hear me out," Nick said, his voice strained. "I was with Sarah the night of the accident." A chill ran down my spine. "What?" She called me. Said she wanted to talk, to meet. So I did. We met at a bar, had a few drinks. She seemed off. I asked her what was going on, and she just kept talking about you, about the kids, about how she had screwed everything up. My hands clenched into fists. "So what? You're telling me this is my fault?" "No," he said quickly. "No, that's not what I'm saying. Just, let me finish." After the bar, we went back to her car. She was upset, really upset. She said she needed to fix things, to make it right. And then she just got in the car and sped off. I tried to stop her, Mike. I swear I did. I closed my eyes, the weight of his words crashing down on me. "So she tried to." "I don't know, man," Nick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what she was thinking. But I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." There was nothing left to say. I hung up the phone and sat there in the silence, trying to make sense of it all. Had Sarah really been that lost, that broken? And had I played a part in pushing her to the edge? The next morning, the hospital called. Sarah was gone. In the end, there were no final confrontations, no grand gestures of revenge. Just silence, loss, and the bitter taste of regret.